Good afternoon, everyone. So once again, we have come together here for our discussions on stylistics. The area for discussion today on stylistics will be the different schools or different approaches that we usually use for stylistic analysis. Our main interest lies in the analysis of foregrounding, especially the linguistic foregrounding that a writer does in a creative writing. And this linguistic foregrounding is done on different levels. We shall today discuss all these different levels of analysis. The first, most important area of analysis is graphological analysis. So this is a new area where we focus on the graphics of any literary production. Graphics refer to the print material that we usually find, or today in the virtual medium, in the digital medium, the impression, the image of the text that we find. As stylistics deals with the main area of linguistic foregrounding, graphology plays an important part. At the first impression, a graphic text, especially in the visual world of advertisement and media communication, we find that this is very important. So it imprints on our mind, on the form, and draws our attention to the content. So this type of graphics, in case of poetry, is visible when we find a lot of blank spaces left on a page, and a different type of print or impression is there on the paper. Analysis of this graphic or the visual text is the area of graphological analysis. It is in part an analysis of the verbal, visual, semiology, or the sign language of the text. We know every text that is verbal text is represented in the orthographic medium with the use of letters that we call alphabets. English language has 26 alphabets, and through these 26 alphabets, the imprint is made on a paper. And when we find that imprint, we can decode that imprint and get the verbal content of the text. Any kind of stylization related to the verbal text in print in its graphological manifestation is called graphological analysis. So graphological analysis is the first and foremost area of stylistic analysis that takes into account the imprinted verbal material in the text. Sometimes this verbal material is also supported with sign language or semiotic material. So these are not fully used in the printed version because of the limitations. But there are certain poets like, say, William Blake or Rossetti's, both Gabriel Rossetti and Christina Georgina Rossetti, who used to employ some kind of visual verbal representation of the text. Even in Sukumar Ray's works, we find that the poem is supported by some kind of visual text. A study of the visual and the verbal text combined is another field of study. Although it is also a part of graphological analysis, it is another field of study called ekphrastics. Ekphrastics is a study that is a part of linguistics, of course, but also takes into account semiology of the text, where the visual and the verbal, the image of the verbal text and the image that is there drawn by the poet or any other illustrator, both are interrelated for analysis. You must be aware that William Blake used to draw his own poems, write his own poems, and then with the help of copper plating, he used to print that. And through this reprographic mechanical reproduction of the text he used to circulate the text. So in Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright, we have a visual representation of a tiger standing under a tree, and the text is also written by the poet. So that is a part of ekphrastic analysis of the text, where we have the analysis of the visual with the verbal. Apart from this, in the print medium, we also have some poems where we have the representation of the text as well as the visual image of the content together. So this visual image of the content is represented by manipulation of the printed text, verbal printed text. That means the graphological manipulation is done for the purpose of foregrounding. So I shall be showing you a poem called Easter Wings, and you can easily see for yourself how in this Easter Wings, this poem, the poet has foregrounded the subject matter with the help of visual image, graphological image. I hope you can see on the text a poem named Easter Wings. So as you see the text, do you find any difference in the text? Normal, ordinary text. So graphological analysis will focus on this visual image of the text that is done with the help of print, typographical arrangement of the text. So this is a visual image that we get of the text. So if we just continue seeing the text, so you find that the text has changed. See, this is a print impression. So we can read the text, but the poet has also drawn our attention to the verbal and the visual pattern together. So in this poem, we find a different type of text. See this next text, Sin, where we have a normal, ordinary poem. So we are familiar with this structure of a poem. A special indent has been given, line number 2, line number 3, in order to draw the attention. So this can be regarded as a kind of foregrounding. So George Herbert's poem, Easter Wings, can be regarded as an image poem. So this is called an image poem, where the image of the content is represented by the image of the text. So this is the second area of our analysis. So first was the combination of the verbal and the visual, where the poet has drawn some thing on the page along with the poem and represented the visual, graphological text together. The second is the case where we have a kind of stylistic foregrounding by the arrangement of the text. So these stanzas are written in such a way that they represent or resemble wings. This poem by George Herbert, Easter Wings, is one of the finest specimen of image poetry. So when you are going for a graphological analysis of this, you have to state that the poet has used an image of the wings in order to represent and foreground the content. And as we read the words, we are trying to relate these words with the image of wings. Lord, who created man in wealth and store, though foolishly he lost the same, decaying more and more, till he became most poor. With thee, oh, let me rise as larks harmoniously, and sing this day thy victories. Then shall the fall further the flight in me. So this is the structure of the poem that the poet has used. The third area of graphological analysis, if we get a poem that is more common type of poem, say this stanza of Herbert's poem, where we have a regular structure. In this case, we have to make a graphological analysis of the punctuation mark. Okay, the rules of capitalization, the stanza structure, the line length, and the formation of the image through this print. So we have to focus whether the lines begin all in capital letters or not. In some cases, we have poems that do not have this type of feature. Even in this poem, we have the capitalization at the beginning of every line, but the indent is changed, the length of the line is changed. So we can comment on these features, that the poet has gradually shortened the length of the line and created a kind of graphological or graphical representation so that the lines resemble the wings. Through this stylistic foregrounding, the poet has drawn our attention to the subject matter. So in this we have the use of punctuation. The punctuations are used in a regular manner. There is the use of the run-on line. The sentences are broken into small fragments and are arranged in such a way that the image of the wing becomes more effective. So it is very difficult to convert this in the typographical image because the poems are mostly written in handwriting. So the poet has to be very conscious when he is writing. You must have seen the poems of Tagore. Some of the poems of Tagore in the manuscript form are written in order to represent the image, and that is supported by some kind of drawings. So in most of the texts that are published, we do not have those images, the image of the poem. But the graphical image of the original manuscript also becomes a part of stylistic analysis, because the mind of the poet gets revealed, the intention of the poet gets revealed through this image. So in the poems of Tagore, you can see some of these images in our metro station, Rabindra Sadan metro station. You can see such images of Tagore's poems. And you can see how Tagore has, in his manuscript, tried to convert the graphic image into the poem itself. So in graphological analysis, the main criteria that we will see is the length of the lines, how the lines are broken up, and how the lines are shaped in a stanza form. We will focus mainly on the graphics of the poem rather than the metrical composition or the rhyming pattern. The main focus will be on the graphic imprint, the use of capitalization, the use of various forms of punctuation, okay, the use of bold letters, italics. In several poems, words are used in italics, especially foreign words are used. The size of the font, some important words are given larger font. The use of the title, how the title is used. All these are under graphological analysis. So every poem is regarded as a graphic representation. So we must consider this as an important stylistic part of any poem. So I move on to the next one. The second area of analysis, after the graphic analysis, we will focus on the second, another important aspect of stylistic analysis called phonological analysis. Just for your revision, you have already done classes in phonetics, By phonemes, we mean minimal, distinctive, indivisible unit of language that can be represented through phonetic symbols. English RP, receipt pronunciation, uses 44 such phonemes in language. Although there are only 26 alphabets, we have 44 phonemes in English RP. These 44 phonemes in English RP are further divided into vowels and consonants. Okay, 20 are vowels and 24 consonants. These phonemes that are called vowels are further classified into monophthongs and diphthongs. Pure vowels, monophthongs, are further classified into short vowels and long vowels. There are 7 short vowels and 5 long vowels in English RP, along with 8 diphthongs or vowels that are produced with the glide of the tongue. So these 8 diphthongs along with 12 pure monophthongs constitute the vowel of English RP. There are 24 consonantal sounds, and these 24 consonantal sounds are further classified along the process by which the sounds are produced. These sounds are distinct, indivisible, and minimal unit of any language. So we have 24 consonants classified into voiceless consonants and voiced consonants. There are 9 voiceless consonants, and remaining 15 consonants are voiced consonants. Consonants are also classified according to the place of articulation. So there are different places where the active articulators move, and the air is modified when it passes through the gap between the active and the passive articulator. The consonants are further classified on the basis of the manner of articulation. So how the stricture is used, the manner of articulation is used. In English RP, there are most of these sounds. There are 21 oral consonants. Soft palate is raised and the air has to escape through the oral cavity. And there are 3 nasal consonants where we have the lowering down of the soft palate and the passage of the air through the nasal passage. So these phonemes are interestingly used in any kind of literary production, verbal production. Effective foregrounding depends on how the sound structure is manipulated by the writer. And this manipulation is done on different levels. So phonological analysis will focus mainly on the stylization of the sound structure of a verbal text. In modern linguistics, we say that speech is primary, writing secondary, or typing secondary. Where speech is primary, the entire focus falls on the articulation of the text. Okay, the sonority of the text. So a text that is more sonorous, audible, pleasing to our ears, usually appeals to our senses. So the poets have been trying to manipulate the sound to make poetry more metrical, lyrical, sonorous, appealing directly to our senses. So you must have read so many poems and heard so many songs, and you are familiar with this musical composition. You can retain for a long time the memory of a song because of the lyrical effect that it produces on our ears. So we have words that are used in poetry. What are words? Words are basically sounds, sounds that carry some kind of meaning. So when we use the sonority of the word, we also focus on the syllabic structure of the word. In English language, we have monosyllables, and polysyllables, di, tri, tetra, penta, syllabic words. And this different length of the word also contribute to the readability of a poem. The audible effect of the poem is manipulated by the poet. So the selection of monosyllabic word in a poem will give more force to the articulation, while polysyllabic words that are used in poem gradually slow down the articulation. So we have poets manipulating with these. So first is the syllabic structure. This is the first point, very important point, where we have the analysis of the syllabic structure. So we will simply write whether the poet has used monosyllabic words or polysyllabic words. The abundance of monosyllabic words make the language racy. The abundance of polysyllabic words make the language more reflective, slow, meditative. In the choice of the phonemes in such words, the poet is very conscious, especially in the dramatic text and in the poetic text, where the performance of sound is very important. We have the use of language in such a way. Novel, on the other hand, requires a kind of passive reading, while poetry and dramatic text requires active performance of the text. So wherever we have the active performance of the text, there is more focus on the phonological structure, the effect the language produces on the mind of the readers. For the best foregrounding, the poets have always used clusters of sound. So after syllable, we will focus on the clusters, the sound clusters, how the sound clusters are organized by the poet. The basic syllabic structure requires a syllable to have a nucleus. This nucleus is a vowel. This nucleus vowel is supported by the marginals, the consonants. Either they are the open consonants or the closed consonants, releasing consonants or the arresting consonants that are there around this nucleus vowel in a syllable. So we have consonant clusters that are very forceful, and the poets usually select from a menu of words the appropriate consonantal cluster to represent the sound effect, to make the poetry more sonorous. Say in this line, a slumber did my spirit seal, or a philomel in melody sings a lullaby. The sound structure that we find is more sonorous, and the clusters that are used are consonantal but softer clusters, soft sounding consonantal clusters. So Wordsworth describes a mighty waterfall by using or manipulating the sound of the consonantal clusters. If you remember a line, the cataracts blow their trumpets from the steep. So if you listen carefully to the sound effect that is produces in order to replicate the sound of a waterfall, you will find how these consonantal clusters are appropriately used. I repeat the line: the cataracts blow their trumpets from the steep. The cataracts blow their trumpets from the steep. So we have a visual image of a hill holding a trumpet in the hand and blowing that, almost similar to the image of a waterfall that is flowing down from a steep hill. But that sound of the waterfall is captured by the poet by the use of this phonological structure of patterning the consonants in such a way, patterning the consonant clusters in such a way that the sound of the waterfall is partly replicated. This type of effect is produced with the employment of several figurative devices also. So can you identify such figurative devices that will help the poet to produce the sound effect? Figures of speech based on sound. What are these figures of speech based on sound? So on the third level of phonological analysis, we will focus on the figures of speech based on sound. As you please remember that the figures of speech based on sound are called, yes, number one, alliteration.
Onomatopoeia.
Onomatopoeia, very good.
Assonance.
Assonance, consonance.
Yes, sir.
So these are the figures of speech based on the sound structure. Even minor figures of speech based on sound structure like pun, euphony, cacophony, these are also there. Sibilance is also there. So as you have pointed out, onomatopoeia as an important feature of poetics, of poetry. So we will focus first on onomatopoeia. So how this onomatopoeia is used in poetry? So we must say that onomatopoeia in poetry is used by a careful selection of the phonemes, especially the consonantal phonemes that appropriate the sound of clap, the sound of whistle. So in order to represent the sound, we have to select appropriate phonemes that has the same sonorous effect, same soundness. Rustle. So here, rustle, ra, sul. So two sounds are used, basic sounds, clusters are used. First is sul, sul, and the first sound is ra. So these are the consonants that surround the vowel. It's a disyllabic word, ra, sul, ra, sul. So the syllabic consonant is also there. So this clustering of sound is done in order to represent the natural sound, the rustling of the leaves. Okay, say rattle, rattle. Again, disyllabic word. The first one has a syllabic structure, consonant vowel, ra, r, and a. The second is a syllabic consonant. Syllabic consonant, tul, tul, where we have again the structure of VC, vowel and consonant. Although the sounds are consonantal, t and l. So rattle, say rattlesnake. Rattlesnake produces a sound, and that is represented by the name rattlesnake. So when we think of a snake, rattlesnake, we think of the rattling sound produced by the snake, and that sound almost resembles the sound of rattle. When we transcribe the word rattle, the sound it produces is similar to the sound, natural sound of a rattlesnake. The buzzing of the bees. See how the word bees. So bees, buzzing, the sound produced by the flattering of the wings of the bees. So that is also onomatopoeic sound. Such onomatopoeic sounds are done with the help of the arrangement of the consonants. So there are different types of consonants that produce the desired effect. The first type of sound that produce a proper sound effect is called sibilants. Okay, the group of sounds in your phonological structure map, you will find that there are several sounds that are in this group of alveolar or palato-alveolar sounds. Sounds like s, sh, z, okay, z, zu, z, sh. All these sounds are there. So these sounds contribute to sibilant. Okay, sibilant. So by patterning of such sibilants, So many things can be done in poetry. When to the sessions of sweet silent thoughts I summon up remembrance of things past, I sigh the lack of many a things I sought. With old woes, new wail, my dear times waste. Excellent patterning of the sibilants. The sibilance of these lines actually produces a harmonious effect in the mind, in the ear, and this is called phonoaesthetics. So, phonoaesthetics is again related to linguistics. Phono means sound, the aesthetics of the sound is called phonoaesthetics. Phonoaesthetics is a branch within stylistics under the category of phonological analysis that tries to analyze how the writer has used the sound for the desired production of the text for giving aesthetic pleasure to the audience. This is called phonoaesthetics, the aesthetics of sound. So, in the field of music, acoustics, phonoaesthetics plays an important part. Even in Indian poetic tradition, we have the use of shabd, okay, sur, okay, related to each other in order to produce chand. So alankars are there in Indian literature that are used in order to produce the desired effect. Say Meghadutam of Kalidasa makes an excellent use of such sound effects in order to represent the natural phenomena. When there is thunder, lightning, cloud, the entire sound is represented through the sound effect of the language. Such alamkaras in English also we have figures of speech based on sound that are helpful to produce the eco-poetic effect. Okay, the sound effect, the phonic effect, the sonic effect. So phonic effect, sonic effect, all these are combined to give a sonorous rasa. Rasa is in Indian literary theory related to the relishing of the juice, the aesthetic pleasure that is derived both by the performer as well as the audience is called the rasa. So such rasas are also produced with the help of the onomatopoeic effect. Sri Aurobindo stated that in poem, wherever you are talking about nature, you should try to come as close as possible to the sound of nature. And he says that if such sounds of nature are replicated in poetry, poetry will have its own sonorous effect and it will come very close to the incantatory mantric composition that we find in the mantras. He was experimenting with this in his own poems. Say a poem like Tiger and the Deer, where we have this tiger working in silence because the tiger is preying on the deer, secretly spying on the activities of the deer. The deer is oblivious of the presence of the tiger, hiding, lurking in the forest. So this sound is captured even in plays, especially the plays of Shakespeare. We have this interesting use of sound. So Macbeth has just committed his most heinous crime in the play, the murder of Duncan. So he rushes out. So he is almost breathless, is afraid. His hands are blood-stained. So he comes before Lady Macbeth, trembling, breathlessly speaking some lines. There you find the use of the word stuck. Wherefore I could not pronounce the word stuck in my mouth. So he could not pronounce the word Amin. The word stuck in his mouth. So on the stage, when this breathless man will be trying to say that to the audience, the entire foregrounding will be done through this word stuck. So when Macbeth is towards the end of the play, delivering his soliloquy, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dust to death. So where we have Macbeth trying to focus his attention on time, how the time is going away, and he is looking for future time. So the repetition of the word tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace. So here we have a patterning of the sound r, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, along with the harsh consonantal sound t. So apart from sibilance, we also have the patterning of harsh consonantal sounds, lateral sounds like l. So if you combine the sibilants and the lateral sounds are also called liquid sounds, very easy flowing l sounds. So when you have a patterning of sa and l or sha and l, you have got a kind of effect that is very free flowing. A slumber did my spirit seal, sala, sala. So the poet is playing with this sound of sa and la, patterning that in order to produce the desired effect. We also have voiced consonants that are used in order to produce the desired effect in the mind of the readers. So the sound of the drum, the sound of the lyrical instrument, all these are combined together in Coleridge's Kubla Khan through a patterning of the sound for onomatopoeic effect. So we have a voiced consonant d being used, a damsel with a dulcimer. So da da, the repetition of the sound. Then we have the patterning of the sa sound in the same lines. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. It was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me a symphony and a song? See how the poet is using the sound of the voice consonant d along with the alveolar consonant s. And through this patterning of sa and d, the desired effect is produced in the mind of the readers. So much of the phonoaesthetics of Kubla Khan depends on the patterning of the sound that has a phonological effect in order to maximize the phonoaesthetic appeal that the poet makes on the mind of the readers. So Kubla Khan has often been considered as one of the best lyrical compositions. In most of such lyrical compositions, we find similar patterning. Say, one of the most musical poems, a poem by John Keats, La Belle Dame Sans Merci. If you read the lines of this poem, you will find how the poet has used the liquid sound along with the sibilance in order to produce the musical effect. So you want to listen to the song or just the poem? It is a ballad. Ballads are meant to be sung. Most of the poems that are meant to be sung are more sonorous than the poems that are meant for rhapsody or recitation. Oh, what can ail the knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail the knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail the knight at arms, so haggard and so woe-begone? The squirrel's granary is full and the harvest is done. I saw a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. See, John Keats works on the sound effect in order to produce the desired image of this knight at arms stranded in the frozen field by the side of a lake, lost, withered. He has an encounter with this dame who has taken him to the elfin grot, and there he has been abandoned, jilted in love. And now this narrator is meeting this knight at arms and singing the songs. When we hear the voice of the narrator, we have the excellent use of the liquid sound that produces a sense of hopelessness, a sense of the freezing landscape, freezing sensuality of the knight who has been jilted in love. And when the knight at arms starts reciting his own lines or singing his lines, we have a similar narratology or the production of the lines with a maximum sonorous effect. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairest child. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairest child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, her eyes were wild. See how this has changed? Before this stanza, the narrator has asked the poet, the knight at arms, I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose, fast with her too. From where is this musicality coming to the poem? What can be the source, probable source of this musicality? So you must accept that this poem has the sonorous quality because of the arrangement of the sounds. All the figures of speech based on sound are employed for the production of the theme, of the subject matter. And the poet is drawing our attention, drawing our audience to this sonority of the text that has the phonoaesthetic effect. So in the poems of Wordsworth also we have this. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. Even in Immortality Ode, the poet is writing the lines in such a way that it produces a sonorous effect. There was a time when meadows, birds, and grove. This poem is more a poem that is replicating the voice of the consciousness, a kind of voice of remembrance. And therefore, this is more suitable for recitation than for lyrical exuberance. In the same poem, the poet is also using the lyrical exuberance, where the spontaneity is suggested through the employment of such phonological component, arrangement of the phonemes. So the first stanza talks about this meditative, reflective, prosaic. There was a time when meadows, birds, and groves, the stream and every common sight to me did seem, apparelled in celestial light, the glory and freshness of a dream. It is not now, as it had been of yore, turned wheresoever it may, by night or day. The things which I have seen, I can see no more. The rainbow comes and goes, and beautiful is the rose. See, the rhyming that is used in poetry is always used to produce this effect on the mind of the readers. You have read the sonnets of Shakespeare, where we have a rhyme scheme, ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE. Okay, different types of rhyme schemes are used. Either there is an octave or a sestet, 3 quatrains are there, or a couplet. The rhyme couplets produces a different type of sonorous effect on the mind of the readers. We have also heroic poems. Heroic poems where the coupling is used, heroic couplet is used. The rhyme scheme is also another aspect of this type of. So sibilance, liquid sound, okay, consonantal structures, clusters that are harsh, clusters that are soft, liquid sounds, all these contribute to the onomatopoeic effect that the poem produces. In most of the nature poems, where we have the sound effect more prominent, we have the employment of onomatopoeia. Apart from onomatopoeia, we have already noticed that how alliteration, assonance, consonance, all these are used in order to produce the desired sonorous effect. So in the phonological analysis, point number 3, we will focus on the figures of speech based on sound and how these figures of speech that are mainly based on the phonetic structure, the phonemic structure, the phonemic patterning, the patterning of the phonemes, produce the desired aesthetic effect and contribute to the formation of the meaning in mind's ear. Mind also has an ear, and that effect on the mind's ear is produced by the effect on the real ear. Even when we are reading the poem silently, that sound is producing an effect on the mind's ear. So this is an aspect of phonological analysis. Phonological analysis number 4 depends also on the metrical composition. Although there was a debate between Wordsworth and Coleridge whether meter is at all required for poetry or not, William Wordsworth simply stated that my task is to write poems that almost represent the natural language really used by men. And he came to the conclusion that there is not an essential difference between the language of prose and language of poetry. Whenever you write good prose, it has a tendency to become good poetry, according to William Wordsworth. On the other hand, Samuel Taylor Coleridge opposed this view and stated that there is an essential difference between the language of poetry and the language of prose, because poetry is metrically composed. So now if you take Coleridge's opinion into consideration, vis-a-vis Wordsworth's statement that whenever you write a good prose, it becomes poetry, you talk about meter. So meter is closely related with the pattern of stress that we find in language. English language is isochronous. Okay. So this isochronicity of English language depends on the stress pattern that is there. So equal timeness or time gap between two stressed syllables make English language isochronous or stressed timed language. There is another alternative. This alternative is syllable timed language. In case of Sanskrit, we have the syllable timed language that is used in Hindi, Bangla, languages that are based on Sanskrit, Pali or Prakrit. So we have there a syllabic timed language. That means all the syllables contain a vowel and we have equal focus or emphasis on the syllables. In the mantric compositions, karmanyavadhikarastha ma phaleshu kadachit. So you see, all the syllables are equally pronounced. Karmanyavadhikarastha ma phaleshu kadachit. So there is no patterning or variations of the stress. All the syllables are independently produced and we have this syllabic timed rhythm that is produced in the Sanskrit language. On the other hand, we have English language where all the syllables do not receive stress. The stress is an important aspect of English language because English language has a stress pattern, accent pattern, important syllables of lexical items, means words that are used as noun, verb, adverb, adjective. They receive stress, while the grammatical units, parts of speech like preposition, conjunction, so they do not receive stress. And in connected speech, we have a patterning of the stress. In Shakespeare's sonnets, the lines are patterned in a proper order, a metrical order. We call that metrical order iambic. That means unaccented, accented. A pair is made. And this disyllabic pair is called iambic. Therefore, there are 5 iambics in each line of Shakespeare's sonnet. And we call that iambic pentameter line. So this is a metrical composition. You are aware of meter, you have done scansion. So your task number 4 will be to make a metrical analysis of the lines. Select any 1 or 2 line of the poem and go for a metrical analysis. The same way you did the scan. And you see whether the pattern is regular or not. So monometrical foot is there, single meter foot. At the beginning, if that foot is there, independent, we call that acephalous. If a single foot is there at the end, we call that catalectic. So these are monosyllabic foot. While unaccented syllable that remains as independent foot at the beginning or at the end, these are not counted as foot. These are hypermetrical. Extra meter, hypermetrical. It's not counted as foot. In Shakespeare's sonnet, so you have read so many sonnets of Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So can I read this as shall I compare thee to a summer day? We cannot. Can we recite this line like this? We cannot, because this is a wrong way of reading the line. When we are reading this line, we have to read this in such a way that the normal linguistic stress pattern is maintained. So this is an interrogative question. So it also has a tone, rising tone with an interrogation. Shall I? Where do you place the stress? Shall or I? Yes? Where do you place the stress?
I.
Compare. Okay, compare.
I.
This word, I, you are placing stress on I. So we read this line along with the stress pattern. Shall I compare thee to a summer day? Is it possible? Can we read the line in this way? Or
No, sir.
shall we read this line in a musical, more musical way? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? We can? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we can read this.
Sir.
So it is more lyrical, more metrical. The regular iambic pattern is used. Shall I compare thee to a summer day? Or sa is accented, ma is unaccented. Day is again accented. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. So there is a variation. So poets, they cannot write correct iambic pentameter lines. They sometimes use new forms, experimental forms, mixing different types. So we have a combination of iambic with trochaic, iambic with anapistic. So in the disyllabic foot, we have 4 major variations in English metrical prosody. These are iambics, unaccented, accented, a pair of foot. Then we have trochaic, trochee, accented, unaccented. So I am, unaccented, then accented. Then we have trochee. First syllable is accented, the second syllable is unaccented. So when the supernatural machinery comes in Macbeth, the witches. So how will the witches speak? Fair is foul and foul is fair. Correct way of reading the line. Or shall I say like this? Fair is foul and foul is fair. Which one is the correct one? So this is a trochaic line. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and fill the air. Regular trochaic. So when the witches will come, dance around the altar, and they will sing, thrice to mine and thrice to thine, thrice again to make up nine. Again trochaic line. So do These lines sound supernatural, unnatural compared to the iambics. English language has iambics as a normal, unaccented, accented, unaccented, accented, stress timed language, isochronous language. So iambic is a normal feature of English, and there is equal time gap between two stress syllables. But in case of trochaic, again the gap is similar between two stress syllables. But we have first the emphatic syllable and then the unaccented, unstressed syllable. So when the supernatural in Macbeth come, they speak in the trochaic. When Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, they come, they speak in the iambics. To be or not to be. Hamlet is speaking. See how he is using the iambics. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is noble in mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms against the sea of trouble, and by opposing end them. So he is using regular iambic, conversational language that is there in English. So we have equal time gap between two stress syllables. So you go for a metrical analysis of the lines and show how the meter reflects or represents the content of the text. Why is the form and content interrelated with the help of meter? So I have referred to Keats's poem La Belle et Sans Merci, where the metrical arrangement is such that the sonorous effect is produced by iambic tetrameter lines. But you must have noticed that the last line of this 4-line stanza, ballad stanza as a pattern, is missing the last two syllables, and it is condensed. The last line is dimetrical line. Shall I read the line again and you will find? So this knight at arms has been abandoned, jilted by the lover. Okay, the dame, the queen of the elfin grot, she has abandoned this man. And in order to represent that sense of abandonment, the frozen desire of this man, the poet is experimenting with the sound effect by shortening the line, the last line of each stanza. Oh, what can ail the knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. The last line, no birds sing. So we have just iambics, but the length of the line is shorter one. A sense of abandonment, something is frozen, something is end, abruptly, that is being suggested. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose, fast withered too. So all the lines of these stanzas, the last line of these stanzas, end with dimeter rather than tetrameter. So instead of 4 feet, we have 2 feet in the last stanza. So the metrical composition is very important in case of the representation, the lyrical composition. Ode form is more flexible than sonnet form. In sonnet form, all the lines are to be iambic lines with 10 syllables in each line. So there is a sense of metrical proportion in all the lines of a sonnet. In case of other forms of poems, especially the lyrics or the ode, we have more flexibility. But sonnet, ballad, these forms are more structured. Heroic poetry, Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock. So all the lines are written in iambics, with few exceptions, with a few kind of variations that we find. And then there is a coupling of the lines. Heroic couplet has been used. In case of Shakespeare, we have the use of iambic pentameter lines, but the rhyming is not done. That form is called blank verse. So these are different forms that the poets use, the writers use. In case of novel, in case of prose fiction also, we have such experiment. Say Virginia Woolf's works, Mrs. Dalloway. We have sentences that try to capture the stream of consciousness. In case of James Joyce, we have such experiment with language. The beginning, the opening of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man has an innovative formal organization where we can hear the sound the replicated sound of the small child, although there is no meter used there in case of prose composition, the poets tend to represent the sonority of the consciousness, the sound produced in the consciousness that is being impacted upon the mind of the readers through this stylistic foregrounding. This is called phonological foregrounding. Okay, phonological foregrounding. So after doing this analysis of the meter, point number 5, in case of phonology, we will focus on the rhyme scheme. You understand what rhyme scheme is? So in case of analysis of rhyme, we will take the last sound of each line. Okay. If the line is short, then also we will take the last sound of the line. If the line is long, we will take the last sound of the line in order to analyze the rhyme scheme is there or not. In 20th century poems, we also have the employment of free verse. There can be also a mixture of free verse along with the rhymed verse in case of modern poetry. Say T.S. Eliot's poem, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. There we have a combination of free verse with rhymed verse. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread against the sky, like a patient etherized on a table. So free verse. There's no rhyming, no rhyme pattern, A, B, B, A, A, B, B. This pattern is not done. But in the same poem, when we have, in the room women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. So we have equal count, metrical count, and the rhyme. Michelangelo, oh, and finally, yes, in the room women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. So again we have a rhyme. I grow old, I grow old. I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Prufrock is saying these lines. So we have a regular pattern. The heroic coupling is there. The words are not heroic. Okay, the content is not heroic. This is a parodic line. Okay, as opposed to the heroic couplets of John Dryden or Alexander Pope or say Milton. Milton is also using blank verse in his Paradise Lost. Iambic pentameter lines, loud lines, bombastic lines without any verse. But in special cases, he will be also rhyming. Alexander Pope is a master of rhymes, and we have John Dryden, who is also writing rhymed couplet in Macflecknoe, Absalom and Achitophel. Alexander Pope is doing this in The Dunciad. And Peri Bathos is a work written on the figures of speech, and that also uses this rhyme couplet. The Rape of the Lock is another important work. The Rape of the Lock the beginning of the Rape of the Lock, we find the use of couplet. What dire offense causes from amorous causes spring. Okay, so ing, the couplet is there, used in the lines. Sol through the white curtains shot a timorous ray, and hope the eyes that might eclipse the day. So ray and day, coupling. So such type of heroic couplet is used. So we will focus on the rhyme scheme. And how to write the rhyme scheme? You have to identify the sound. The first sound is called A. Second sound, if it is new, you have to represent that by B. Third sound, if it repeats the first sound, the end sound of line number 1, it will be written as A. In the fourth line, if the sound is a new one, represent that by C. So you have to practice this. Okay, finding out the rhyme scheme. Try out with sonnets of Shakespeare, and you will find that there is a definite rhyme scheme. ABBA, ABBA. Okay, ABBA. Then CC or DD or EE. AB, BA, ABBA, or another pattern can be there. ABBA, CDDA, CDDC. Okay, EF, EF. So any kind of pattern can be used in case of sonnets. Such rhyme scheme contribute to the structure. In case of ballads, the ballad that I sang, there is again a rhyme structure, and this rhyme structure is applicable in almost all the ballads. What can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely, loitering, the sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. So we have A, B, then A, B. That structure is used. So such rhyme structure contribute to the total effect, sonorous effect on the mind of readers. Such lyricism is possible. That will be the fifth part. This is very easy to find out, the rhyme scheme of the lines. Next point, point number 6, will be on the effect of the stanza. The sound structures of the stanza independently you can analyze, and the use of various forms of sound that are incorporated in the pattern, in the rhyme pattern, in the stanza pattern, whether there is a variation, a change in the pattern or not. So these are the basic 5-6 points that you find in phonological analysis. So keep a separate paragraph on the phonological analysis. Try to search for these basic 5 or 6 points that you find in all the works. If it is a prose stanza, you have to prose paragraph, you have to write something different. When it is poetry, you have to find out something different. That's the basic difference in the phonological analysis of prose and poetry. In case of poetry, you find that the phonological analysis is more structured. Phonological component is more structured. You can also talk about the rhythm that is produced. Rhythm is also there, an important component in case of poetry. Accent and rhythm both are combined together in case of poetry. So we have these different aspects of phonological analysis. So if you have any question regarding graphological analysis and phonological analysis, you can ask or you can offer your valuable suggestions. Thank you very much for your audience.